It is time to close out the year that was 2024. I'm here today to share some stats and my favorite books of last year. Hello book friends, I'm Jen and welcome to my reading life and welcome to my 2024 reading year wrap up. This is my first year of wrapping up books here on BookTube, and I am so excited to share with you both some reading statistics from last year as well as all of my favorite books. And I have quite a few because I don't feel like I should narrow down my favorites into 10 or 20 or 25. If they were a favorite, they were a favorite and they make it onto the list. And if they're a book that I think is going to stay with me and one I'm going to be thinking about and want to reread, then it is definitely a favorite. I believe I have 34 books to share with you today, which is quite a bit. So we better get going or we're going to be here all day. I'm going to try to get through this fairly quickly, but grab yourself a beverage or a snack maybe, or a meal. Let's see how long we're going to be here and let's get going. I have my handy dandy reading journal here, and so I'm going to be consulting this because I thought right off the top I would just give you some statistics of what my reading year ended up being like for 2024. I read more books last year than I have ever read in my entire life in a single year, and I ended up reading 181 books, which is unreal. I will say that I did read quite a few middle grade books for middle grade March and beyond that. So there were quite a number of shorter books on the list, which helped me get to such a high number. And I am not one who is trying to reach a certain goal of number of books read per year. I feel like you should read however many books feels comfortable to you. If that's 2 books, if that's 20 books, if that's 100 books, whatever feels good to you and feels like it makes your reading life be what you want it to be, then that's how many books you should read. Apparently in 2024, that was 181 books. Of those 181 books, I did DNF 10 of them. So technically I only completed 171 books. That's still better than any other year I've ever had. But I did DNF those. However, the ones that I counted towards my reading goal, I at least read a significant amount of. It wasn't like I just read one page and then said, nope, I'm not going to read this. If I did that, I just unhauled it and it didn't even make it into my list of books read last year. However, if I spent any amount of time, 40 pages, 80 pages, 100 pages, then it went onto my DNF, because I feel like if I spent any amount of time with a book, then I did read some of it. And I also want to be able to have that in my accounting of the books that I've read in the year and to make note of it and maybe why I DNF'd it, so that I know in the future, if I come across that book, oh, I already tried that. It didn't work for me for this particular reason. And then next, of my 181 books that I read, 25 of them were rereads, which I feel very proud of. I wasn't ever a big rereader until about 3 years ago, when I decided to make it a little project of mine to spend time rereading some of my favorite books. And then I got bitten by the rereading bug. And now I really enjoy rereading. It is a good part of my reading year. And sometimes it's just comforting to go back to a book where you know the story, you know the characters, and then I find I just get something new out of it every time I read it. And that is my plan for this year, is to continue to reread. I'm already rereading a book for this year. Actually, I've already completed a reread for this year. So I'm off to a good start. And then I just wrote down my top 4 genres / categories of books that I read from and how many books I read in each. So I read 19 nonfiction books. That's pretty good for me. I have been really working on reading more nonfiction because I do enjoy certain types of nonfiction, and I have quite a few nonfiction on my unread shelves, and I'm going to try to get to some more of them this year. And then I read 30 classics last year, and my category for classics includes both what we typically think of as classics. I also included books that I would consider to be modern classics in that category genre as well. So 30 of those. And then I read 35 middle grade. As I mentioned, I read quite a few of those. And then my top genre outside of just general fiction, I read 40 mysteries last year. Of course, the Lord Peter Wimsey mystery series helped a lot with that, but I was really impressed that I read 40 mysteries last year. It didn't feel like I read that many. So those are my statistics for my 2024 reading year. I was trying to think of the best way to share my favorites with all of you in this video, and I ended up deciding to break these out into different categories and share my favorite books from each category. So I have 7 categories that I'm going to share today. I'm going to talk about favorite series that I read last year, favorite rereads, favorite nonfiction, favorite middle grade, favorite mysteries, favorite classics, and then favorite fiction. Those are my 7 categories we are going to go over. And let's get started with the first category, which is going to be series that I read. Now, not all of these have I read the entire series, but these were series that I started in 2024 and either finished or am continuing on with, but really stood out to me. The first of which is, of course, The Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon by Beth Brower. There are currently 8 volumes out in the Emma M. Lyon series, and I have read all 8 of them in 2024. I finished volume 8 in December. And as you know, I am hosting an Emma M. Lyon read-along this year from January until August. We're going to read 1 volume each month. And if you'd like to join me, all the information for the Emma M. Lyon read-along is in the description box below. This is a fantastic series. It is set in a pseudo-Victorian London in 1883. We follow Emma M. Lyon. She is a young lady who has just returned to her family home, and we get to know her and her relatives and her friends and the very interesting neighborhood of St. Crispians that she lives in. And if this sounds at all appealing to you, I highly recommend giving these books a whirl. They are written in journal format and they are absolutely charming. My next series is a mystery series, and I only read the first 3 books of this series, but my plan for 2025 is to complete it, and that is the Mrs. Polifax mysteries. This is the first book, The Unexpected Mrs. Polifax by Dorothy Gilman, and in this we follow 60-something Mrs. Polifax, and she is widowed and lives alone, and she decides to take it upon herself to offer her services to the CIA. And through a series of events, she ends up becoming a courier for the CIA, and she goes off on missions. And of course, things don't necessarily go quite as smoothly as either she or the CIA would have hoped. She gets herself into all kinds of scrapes, but she is quite plucky. She's an older protagonist that you can really root for. I absolutely adore her, and I cannot wait to read the rest of the series in 2025, but this was a highlight. So delightful. I can't recommend this enough. Then next up, it was my goal to read the 5 books from this series that I had on my shelf, and that was the Little House series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I read 5 books from the Little House series: Little House in the Big Woods, Little House on the Prairie, On the Banks of Plum Creek, By the Shores of Silver Lake, and The Long Winter. Oh my gosh, did I get all of those? That was kind of impressive off the top of my head. I think most people are familiar with the Little House on the Prairie series, book series, as well as the TV series. This is about pioneer life, and Laura Ingalls Wilder does a fantastic job of just drawing you in to her life and to what it was like to be a pioneer. And as I keep saying every time I read one of these, I never would have made it. But talk about resilience and strength of the people that founded our country here in the United States. I'm not saying that is not without complications and issues, but I think it's worthwhile to read these books, even as an adult. I think it gives you a perspective that you wouldn't otherwise have if we didn't have these stories. And I'm planning to continue on. I think I have 3 more books in the Little House series to read. Plus, I have a book of Laura Ingalls Wilder's letters that she wrote when she came to San Francisco. And that is how I'm going to finish out my reading of the Little House books. And then my last series had to, of course, be a family saga, and it may just be my new favorite family saga, and that is the Chadwick Family series by Marcia Willett. And this is the first book, Looking Forward. The second book is Holding On, and the third book is Winning Through. And in this, we follow the Chadwick family. The children in the Chadwick family have come home to England to live with their grandmother because their parents and older brother have been killed while they were living, I think, in Africa. And so the children are obviously grief-stricken, and there's a lot of trauma going on there, but they are taken into the fold of their grandmother's world with her and the two people who live with her and work for her, and we just follow all of the characters in this story and the children as they grow up and get married and have children of their own. Such a fantastic family saga. If you like family stories, absolutely give this one a go. It is just wonderful. Moving right along, my next category is going to be my favorite rereads of 2024, and I have 3 favorites that I read last year. The first is, of course, my favorite author, Laurie Colwin, and this is Happy All the Time. I buddy read this with my friend Elizabeth, and as always, it is a delight to return to the world of Guido and Holly and Vincent and Misty and their relationships and life in New York City in the 1970s. Laurie Colwin has a way of describing relationships and just a turn of phrase that I absolutely adore. I just said recently in a review of mine of one of her short story collections that I posted on Goodreads that even though I don't always love everything she has to say, I love the way that she says it. She's a fantastic writer. Love this book. So much warm fuzziness for it. Then next up was a reread that we read for the Cozy Reader Book Club in August, and that was The Shell Seekers by Rosamund Pilcher. This cover is so shiny. This is another family saga, and in this we follow Penelope Keeling. She's in her 60s, I believe, and we go back and forth in time. We see her life when she was a young woman and growing up through the ages. We see her get married and have children, and we learn all about her family and her life, and it is just the most wonderful book. I cannot recommend The Shell Seekers and Rosamund Pilcher enough. If you've read other Rosamund Pilcher, you definitely need to read this one. I think it is one of her very best. And then my third favorite reread of 2024, of course, had to be Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This is still my favorite classic of all time. I just whizzed through this book. It was so lovely. I did this as a group read with a few friends, and it was just so lovely to be in Jane's world and to talk about her with other people who love Jane and love this book, and so delightful. I'm not gonna wait. I think it's been like 20 years since I first read this. Not gonna wait 20 years to read it again. In fact, I might listen to the audiobook for Victober this coming year. I've been considering that. We will see if I get to it. Next up, I am going to share my favorite nonfiction from the year, and the first book would have to be one that I have gushed about in numerous videos, and I'm going to gush about it again, and that is Some Writer, the story of E.B. White. This is by Melissa Sweet, and this is just such a wonderful middle grade nonfiction book. It has like collages of pictures in it and tells the story of E.B. White's life. And I was completely charmed by this. I love E.B. White, I love Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little and The Trumpet of the Swan. They are fantastic middle grade books, and Charlotte's Web was such a big part of my life as a reader when I was a child, and I cannot recommend this one enough. If you've enjoyed E.B. White's stories, then absolutely read this. It's a beautiful book and really well put together. Next up, I have a sort of a celebrity memoir, and that is Hooked by Sutton Foster. This is How Crafting Saved My Life. If you don't know Sutton Foster, she's a Broadway star and a TV actress, and in this, she tells how she used crafting to help her through lots and lots of difficult situations in her life. Her relationship with her mother was very fraught, and she started acting in theater at a very young age, and She was really put into some situations that she wasn't really quite mature enough to handle, and it's amazing that she's come out as lovely a person as she appears to be. But I really enjoyed this, and it made me want to go out and get a crochet hook and start crocheting, which I have done a little bit, but in 2025 I really want to teach myself how to crochet. If anyone has any suggestions for good videos or books on learning to crochet, please leave them in the comments, because I've been looking for some good instructional information on crocheting. Then my next nonfiction favorite is Letter from New York by Helene Hanff. And this is actually a series of broadcasts that Helene Hanff put together for the BBC about life in New York City over the course of, I believe, about 6 or 7 years. And Manderley Press has compiled them into this lovely edition, and you just get to learn all about Helene, all about her neighborhood, her neighbors in her building, all of the dogs, because she is definitely a dog lover, that she encounters that belong to neighbors and friends and people in the neighborhood. And this was just delightful. If you love 84 Charing Cross Road, you will absolutely love Letter from New York, and I just thought this was wonderful. Perfect to be back in Helene's world. She's so witty, and I just loved it. And then last, and I can never decide, is poetry nonfiction? Is it not nonfiction? Is it its own thing? So either it's nonfiction or it fits into its own poetry category. Either way, I could not leave this book off because it played such a big part in my reading this year, and that is Devotions by Mary Oliver. I know this book is getting a lot of buzz right now because this is on the Read with Jenna December pick, I believe. But I started reading this back in January, and I read it over the course of the year. I didn't read it every single day, but I read it most days, and I would just sit down with a cup of tea and spend a few moments with Mary Oliver's words, and her poetry is so lovely, and there is buzz around this book for a reason, and I can't wait to collect more of Mary Oliver's poetry collections and read them. And this year I'm going to read her essay collection, Upstream, because I have that on my TBR shelf, and I am motivated to get to it after having read this wonderful collection of poetry. My next category of books is middle grade, and I have 4 middle grade books to share with you today. The first one is one that I'm really surprised I never read as a child because it was very popular in the late 70s, early 80s, and that is The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth George Spear. In this, we are sent back in time to Puritan America. In this, we follow Kit Tyler. She has recently arrived in New England from the Caribbean, and she has come to stay with relatives after the death of her father. And Kit is very precocious, very spunky and plucky, and you know how I feel about plucky heroines, and Kit is right up there at the tippy top. I absolutely loved her story. This was a fantastic read. I will be rereading it again for sure. And yes, it was just wonderful. I'm so sad I didn't read it as a child because I would have absolutely loved it. And I still loved it today. Next up is an epistolary middle grade, and that is Regarding the Fountain by Kate Kleiss. And in this, we follow the students and faculty at the Dry Creek Middle School. Their drinking fountain has sprung a leak, and they need to get it repaired. And they are reaching out to a company to help them do that. And all kinds of shenanigans occur because of this drinking fountain problem. And there is flooding and all kinds of things, and you just have to read this and go along for the very fun, very funny ride that Regarding the Fountain is. The subtitle is A Tale in Letters of Liars and Leaks. Yes, this was so much fun, and I really want to read some of the other books in this series because this was fantastic. Next up is a middle grade that if you love books about books, this is the book for you, and that is A Kind of Paradise by Amy Rebecca Tan. Wow, I got that right. By Amy Rebecca Tan. In this, we follow Jamie Bunn. She has done something at the end of the school year that has gotten her into some trouble, and as punishment, she has to work at the library over the summer, and I believe she has to put in so many hours, and she's not happy about this, but it turns out to be a bit of a life-changing course of events for Jamie. And we follow along with Jamie as she becomes acquainted with the employees and the patrons of the library. And this was just a book lover's book, so I highly recommend it. And then lastly, this was by far and away my favorite middle grade of 2024. It was absolutely delightful. Another book I am so sad I didn't read as a child, and that is Heidi by Joanna Spyri. This classic middle grade book was such a revelation to me. I was completely invested in Heidi's story from start to finish, and it transported me to the Swiss Alps. I was right there with her, and I just loved her entire attitude about life and just taking it as it comes and seeking out the good and the joy in life. And Heidi is just wonderful. She's one of my favorite heroines now, and I'm actually going to be rereading this in March because I just can't wait, because it was so good. So good. I loved it. Next up in my favorite category / genre is mysteries, and I have 3 mysteries that I really loved last year and stood out to me. First up is Exiles by Jane Harper, and this is the 3rd book in the Erin Falk mystery series, which begins with The Dry, and definitely Exiles is a very close second in terms of how much I enjoyed this book. And I loved The Dry. And in Exiles, we follow a woman who has gone missing, and she's been missing for a year. She went missing at a festival, and her baby was left lying in a pram, and she's been nowhere to be found ever since. And Erin Falk is visiting some friends in the Australian wine country, I believe. And his friends are associated with this woman who's gone missing and her family. And so Erin Falk gets involved in solving what has happened to her. And it was completely gripping. I was just on bated breath. What was going to happen, what had happened to this woman, and it was just fantastic. I listened to it on audio, and it was really wonderful, and I highly recommend it. Though I definitely think you should read The Dry first, and you could probably skip the 2nd book in the series. I don't know that you necessarily need to read them in order. The 2nd book was okay. I think that one is called... Is it Force of Nature? I believe it's Force of Nature. But I really, really loved Exiles. It was fantastic. And then my last 2 mysteries both came from the Lord Peter Wimsey series, and that was Gaudy Night and Busman's Honeymoon. Both of them were my favorites in the series when I did my Dorothy L. Sayers Lord Peter Wimsey wrap up. These were the top 2 books that I read in the series, and if you want to hear all my thoughts, I will link my wrap up of that series in the cards and in the description box below. But these 2 entries were just fantastic. I love Harriet Vane. She is such a great counterpoint to Lord Wimsey, and these 2 were the standouts from my year-long read-through of Lord Peter Wimsey. And my next category of books is classics. And I have 5 classic books that I read in 2024 that made it onto my favorites list. And the first one is actually a lyrical poem, and that is The Lady of Shalott by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I read this beautiful illustrated edition that I got from my library, and I just fell in love with both the imagery that Tennyson puts into this poem, and I really felt like the artwork in this particular edition really just brought the poetry to life for me, and I absolutely loved it. It was a standout, and I will definitely read it again. In fact, I may try to get my own copy of that particular edition because it's beautiful. My next classic is maybe more of a modern classic, and that is Someone at a Distance by Dorothy Whipple. This was my very first Dorothy Whipple, and basically this book is watching the breakdown of a marriage when a younger woman comes between a husband and wife and the fallout from that. The novel is told from the wife Ellen's perspective, and I was just completely drawn in to Ellen's world, and I was just completely on Ellen's side and rooting for her the entire book. And while it has a bit of a melancholy overtone to it, I just adored Dorothy Whipple's writing, and I could not put this down. It was absolutely fantastic. I, again, buddy read this with my friend Elizabeth, and it was a standout of the year, and I plan to read more Dorothy Whipple in 2025. Then my next favorite classic was our pick for the Cozy Reader Book Club to read during Victober, and that was The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. And I loved this book. This is my second Wilkie Collins novel that I have read, and I'm a huge fan. This is such a wonderful Victorian sensation novel, and in this we follow a young man. He has taken a job to be a tutor to two young women, and before he heads out to the countryside to them, he is on his way back to London, and he comes across a woman in white on the road, and she is in distress, and he helps her. And then he sort of gets sucked into the mystery of who is this woman, and we go along with him. It was so readable. I loved it, and I cannot wait to read more Wilkie Collins. I'm hoping to get to The Moonstone this year, and yes, this was a highlight for sure. And then my last two classics I actually just talked about in my December wrap up because I finished both of them in December. The first is The Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield. I read this over the course of a number of months in 2024, and I finally finished it, and I just adored it. I love Delafield's writing. She is funny, she is witty, and these 4 books bound up in this one edition were just charming and wonderful, and I'll definitely be revisiting them again in the future. And then lastly, I couldn't not have this book on my favorites of the year, and that is Middlemarch by George Eliot. As you know, I read this in its serialized time frame from December 2023 to December 2024. It was such a wonderful reading experience. I highly recommend reading it in its serialized format. If you want that serialization schedule, I did share it in the description box of my December wrap-up, so you can go there and check that out if you're curious to see how you would read this and follow the schedule of its original serialization. But again, this is a fantastic novel, so epic, filled with likable and unlikable characters, and so much drama and slice of life and all of the things that you want in a novel. And I just really, really enjoyed my time in Middlemarch. Okay, we have made it to my final category, and this is just my general fiction category of favorite books that I read in 2024. And first up is one of the first books that I read in 2024, and that is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. Another book for the Cozy Reader Book Club. Cozy Reader Book Club really did me well in 2024. Quite a few favorites from our read-throughs. And I really loved this very quiet, introspective novel. This book takes place in 1956, and we follow the Reverend John Ames as he is writing a letter to his very young son because he's very ill. He's quite an elderly father, and he is worried he's going to die without passing on and imparting wisdom to his son and his life story. And so that is what he is setting down here. And so we learn all about the Reverend. It is ruminations on faith, on God, on life, on relationships, on fatherhood, and I absolutely adored it. I had planned to read the rest of the books in this series last year. That didn't happen, but hoping to get to at least 1 or 2 more of them in 2025 because I just really fell in love with Marilynne Robinson's writing, and I just want to read more. Next up is an epistolary novel, and that is Frances and Bernard by Carleen Bauer. And this follows the fictionalized friendship between Flannery O'Connor and Robert Lowell. They were friends in real life, and this imagines a correspondence between them. And they discuss writing and life and family and love. And we just get to see what evolves between the two of them and how their lives play out in the course of their letters to one another. And this was such a surprise to me. It is a bit on the literary side, so you have to be in the mood for that. But clearly when I read this, I was, and I loved it. Next is a collection of short stories by one of my very favorite authors, and that is The Blue Bedroom and Other Stories by Rosamund Pilcher. This is one of the very few short story collections where I loved every story in this book. There wasn't one where I was ambivalent or like, that was okay. I was just like, this was so good. Every story at the end of it, I was like, this is so good. And yes, absolutely loved it. Will be reading it again, though I do want to read, I have a couple other Rosamund Pilcher short story collections on my shelf, so I want to read those, and then I'm coming back to this one because it was just wonderful. And then I don't think I've had a reading year in the past 3 years since I first read this author that she has not been on my favorites list, and that is D.E. Stevenson. And this year it is Victoria Cottage that has made it onto my favorites. In this, we follow Carolyn Daring and her family. She has teenage-ish, young adult-ish children, 2 daughters and a son, and we follow their life at Victoria Cottage. Her husband has passed away, and they are just going through life. So it's very slice of life, very English village life. I believe this is set right after World War II. It was written, I think, in 1949. And yes, this is the first book in a trilogy of books about the Daring family. But this one is far and away my favorite. I really enjoyed the other 2 as well. But Victoria Cottage, Carolyn Daring, I want to be friends with her. I want to live next door to her in their village and come over and have tea with her. And yes, it was just wonderful. She's one of my favorite characters. Next up is another Cozy Reader Book Club pick, and this is another very quiet, introspective novel, and that is Hannah Coulter by Wendell Berry. And we follow Hannah Coulter. She is looking back from the later stages of her life, and we just learn all about her and her life. And this is part of Wendell Berry's Port William series, and his writing is so wonderful. I'm going to read you a very short little quote, which I think gives you a good indication of what his writing is like. He says, "Maybe the world is waiting for you to give yourself to it. Maybe it's only then that things can work themselves out." And I love that. I love this. I love Hannah Coulter, and I really want to read more Wendell Berry. But I highly recommend this one. I don't think you need to read the Port William series in any particular order, but this one is absolutely 5 stars. I'll be reading it again. I tabbed it up so much. There were so many wonderful quotes in here. It's just, so good. And then my next favorite was a delightful surprise. This is a retelling of another famous novel, and that is Darling by India Knight, which modernizes The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford, sets it in modern times. And in this, Uncle Matthew is actually an aging 1980s rock star, sort of a heavy metal rock star, who has become now a bit of a recluse. He lives in his home in the English countryside, and he abhors any kind of technology. He doesn't let his kids have cell phones. I don't even think they have a television. We follow along from, is it Fanny? Fanny's perspective, right? As she watches the Radlett family go through their very crazy life, and her cousin Linda, who is one of her dearest friends, and we see what happens to them throughout their sort of coming of age years of life. And I thought this was absolutely a spot on retelling of The Pursuit of Love, which is another novel that I really, really love. And the section in here where India Knight recounts all the things Uncle Matthew detests is laugh out loud funny, and it goes on for pages, and I was in stitches. It was just so, so funny. She's a fantastic writer, really, really great retelling. Next up are 2 books that were recommended to me by my friend Meg from the Meg's Reading Room podcast. And the first book that she recommended was Sipsworth by Simon Van Buie. And again, we have an older protagonist in this. This is definitely a theme of 2024. I read a lot of books with older protagonists. And we follow our main character, who is Helen Cartwright. And she has returned to England after spending most of her life in, I believe, New Zealand. And she's had some tragedy, and she's basically going through the motions of her life and not really living. She watches a lot of TV and she eats the same foods every day. She does the same routine. And then something unexpected comes into her life and changes everything. And it's just so wonderful. There is a bit of darkness to this book, so I would say maybe if you're worried about that, you might want to look up some trigger warnings for this one. But I will say that all is well in the end. I absolutely adored the ending. And yes, this was such a fantastic read, and I'll be rereading this for sure. And then my second recommendation from Meg was Love and Saffron by Kim Fay. And I just adored this epistolary novel about a friendship between an older woman and a younger woman who bond over basically friendship, food, and love. And one lives in the Pacific Northwest and one lives in Los Angeles. And I believe it's in the, is it the 1960s? Yes, set in the 1960s. This will just pull at your heartstrings. If you've ever had a good friend, this book is such a lovely rumination on friendship, and I adored it. And the sequel is coming out in March, and I cannot wait. So highly, highly recommend. Thank you, Meg, for your beautiful recommendations. And then I have 2 more books, and then whew, we are done. My next favorite was one that I read for Spinster September, and that is Near Neighbors by Molly Clavering. And this is the story of Miss Balfour, and she is sort of shy and unassuming, and her older sister has ruled the roost for their entire lives. But her older sister has just passed away. And as such, Miss Balfour becomes enmeshed in the lives of her next door neighbors, which is a mother and her sort of older children to young adult aged kids. She has a few daughters and a son, and Miss Balfour becomes really part of their life. And there's a man who enters Miss Balfour's life, and at first it's hard to tell, is he good? Is he bad? Is something really awful going to happen? And you'll just have to read and find out. But I was completely captivated by this. Molly Clavering and D.E. Stevenson were friends, and both of them influenced each other's writings, and you can definitely tell that in Near Neighbors. And there will definitely be more Molly Clavering books in my future this year for sure. And then my last favorite of the year was the very last book I read this year. And I mentioned this in my December wrap up, but I never pick my favorites until after December 31st because of books like this. And that is Peace Like a River by Leif Enger. This is a family story. It's a story about miracles. It is a story of a young boy growing up. It's a story about the things we do for the people we love. And I just loved this. This was another quiet novel along the lines of Gilead and Hannah Coulter, and I just loved it. I will say that this one read much more like a page-turning, plot-driven book than those other two. Those other two were a bit more meandering in their feel, and I really felt like this one was very propulsive in the way that it was written. And I'll be curious to check out more of Leif Enger's writing because I really, really loved this. And that wraps up my 2024 reading year. It was really fantastic, made even more so by all of you out there. I would love to chat with you in the comments. What were some of your favorite books from 2024? And did you read and love any of the same books that I read last year? Let's chat all things books down in the comments. And if you don't have anything that you'd like to add in the comments, but you want to let me know that you were here, leave a star emoji down in the comments. Since we're talking about favorites and we like to use stars when we rate our books. So leave me a star or 2 or 3 or 5. Let me know that you were here. Comments really do help out the engagement on my channel. And I really, really appreciate you letting me know that you were here and watched all the way to the bitter end because this was a long one, you guys. But thank you so, so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, if you could hit that like button. And if you aren't already subscribed, I'd love you to hit that subscribe button and join my bookish community. And I'll be back with another video very soon. Bye!